I'm Tim Blevins. I'm with Special Collections, which is the Library District's Regional History and Genealogy Division. And you're here today for a very special book event. And we're very pleased to introduce Alice Echols, who is Professor of History at the University of Southern California and author of today's featured book, Shortfall, Family Secrets, Financial Collapse, and a Hidden History of American Banking. And this is a true story of Alice's grandfather, who made off with more than $20 million of Colorado Springs depositors' money during the 1930s. Beginning in 2011, Alice visited Special Collections each summer, and this was to do research on this particular book. Her skills are as a meticulous scholar and a vibrant storyteller, and they've resulted in a captivating book that you just won't want to put down. And I can say this because we got an advance copy, and Chris Nickel snatched it up very quickly. And that's exactly from her words, that she hasn't wanted to put it down. She said it reads like a novel. Alice is no stranger to well-crafted history. She has also authored several books, Daring to be Bad, Radical Feminism in America, 1967 to 1975, Scars of Sweet Paradise, The Life and Times of Janis Joplin, Shaky Ground, The 60s and Its Aftershocks. I love the titles. These are great. And Hot Stuff, Disco and the Remaking of American Culture. Please join me in welcoming Alice Echols.
Thank you, Tim. And, Tim was I'll be talking more about Tim because I really couldn't have done this book. I couldn't have written the book that this became without Tim and Chris and the other wonderful staffers here, archivists, librarians. And that extends. It extends also to the folks in Denver at the State Archives there and Pioneers Museum. And I did some work at the Tutt Library. That was less sort of pivotal. But it is true that this book was a real departure for me. I had to do a lot of retooling to write this book because you can tell from the titles of my books. I'm a historian really of what we call the long 1960s. And so I had to learn a great deal about banking and finance, including loan sharks, because my grandfather started out as a loan shark. I had to learn about the history of Colorado Springs and the American West, and conservatism, because there's to a great extent, this book is gives you a bit of the backstory of current Republican politics today, I think. But what I want to do is I want to begin by reading you a few pages from the opening of this book, which I think are, if I might say so myself, fairly riveting. George Bailey. It's a name that most Americans, or at least those of a certain age, recognize in a flash. With just a bit of prodding, Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life. Even those who've never watched the 1946 film in its entirety usually know whom it is that you're talking about. George Bailey is the small-town banker at the center of Frank Capra's classic Hollywood movie, a man filled with dreams of a big, exciting life. He finds himself, when his father dies suddenly, stuck in his hometown, Bedford Falls. This untimely death shackles George to his father's struggling building and loan association. Consigned to what he disparagingly calls this business of nickels and dimes, he tries to make the best of it, albeit grumpily at first. Kind-hearted, altruistic, and willing to take on Henry Potter, the town's evil banker, George is the sort of person most Americans have rarely, if ever, encountered in the world of financial services. At the same time that George Bailey was doing his best to bring the American dream of home ownership to the working people of Bedford Falls, Walter Clyde Davis was operating a different kind of building a loan association in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And this, of course, is George Bailey. This is during the bank run in It's a Wonderful Life. And this is the police circular for Walter Clyde Davis. George Bailey was a beloved figure, whereas Walter Davis aroused in others feelings of wariness, sometimes even dread. Yet Davis turned his building and loan into the biggest in central Colorado with 3,600 depositors. His success enabled him to buy into a Tony neighborhood, drive luxury cars, and finance summer-long European vacations for his family. And then there was Davis's mistress, another telling difference between the real real-life B&L man and his fictional counterpart. Each man faced financial calamity during the Depression, but George Bailey selflessly handed out his honeymoon money to forestall a bank run engineered by his nemesis, Henry Potter. By contrast, Walter Davis went on the lam before news of his association's failure hit the papers. Back home in Colorado Springs, investigators discovered that the town's quote-unquote financial wizard had left his business with a jaw-dropping $1.25 million shortfall. And again, in today's terms, that's more than $20 million. When detectives arrested him that December, newspapers across America carried the news. Journalists knew the scandal would resonate with Americans who would come to view bankers as a species of gangster, or bankster. Bankster was the term that was often used to describe them. Here was a man, argued one journalist, who had passed himself off as a captain of finance when he was a mere pretender, quote, a cabin boy strutting the bridge in a captain's uniform, end quote. Walter Davis could now be seen for what he was, Captain Nothing. Now, the building and loan industry, once a central part of our country's financial fabric, is really barely remembered today. What has lived on in our cultural memory is not this man, but instead this man. George Bailey has become a fixture. I mean, he really has. I was quite surprised by this once I started doing this research. A fixture in books about banking and finance, home ownership, and the Depression. As for Walter Davis, well, he's pretty much gone missing from our history books. You certainly won't find him in the standard histories of the thrift industry, the term used for both the building and loan industry and the modern savings and loan industry that succeeded it in the Depression years. According to these accounts, the vast majority of building and loans survived the Great Depression. And those that didn't failed because of the collapse of the country's real estate market, not because of any financial impropriety. Indeed, a number of scholars who have written about building and loans depict them as noble institutions. One scholar calls them banks with a soul, and write as if the fictional Bailey Brothers Building and Loan Association was actually representative of the industry. Yet among building and loan men of that period, Walter Davis was hardly anomalous. Neither was his failure or the circumstances surrounding it. This is no small thing. During the Great Depression, the industry's cratering brought untold grief to millions of depositors. Despite this, the history of the American thrift industry during the interwar years remains hidden, really buried in the bowels of state archives and local libraries. My discovery of this forgotten financial history did not begin in the archive, however, but with an almost chance conversation some 20 years ago. I was home. I was visiting my parents. When the dinner time banter one evening went a little bit too far, after my mother left the table, slamming shut her bedroom door for good measure, my father explained the roots of her cellophane-thin sensitivity. He spoke about her family, particularly her cad of a father. His was not a story I should tell you, but I'm not going to tell you anything more about this now because I want you to buy the book. But it was not a story with a Capra-like happy ending. Our conversation that night was my introduction to the man at the center of this book, a man whose name I did not yet know. Within our family, everything about him, stories, photographs, memorabilia, had been banished. Walter Clyde Davis, my grandfather, had been scrubbed as clean from my family as he was from the history books. Now, I had this conversation in the early 1990s, and at that point I was indeed writing a biography of Janis Joplin. I was researching it, writing it. And it took me a number of years before I returned to this. And it wasn't until I think about the year 2000 that a friend of mine, another historian, and I'm going to pick up the thread in this book for a paragraph, persuaded me to start digging. Even then, it was she who did the first bit of spade work by searching for my grandfather in a bound volume of the New York Times Index at the Santa Monica Public Library, then copying and mailing me the relevant articles. This is how we used to do research, right? You know? And that was how I learned that Walter Davis was generally understood to have been an embezzler, rather than the victim of the Depression that my father's account had led me to believe. So that was kind of my starting point. It was like, okay, so my father tells me about my maternal grandfather, but he presents him as a victim of the Depression. Well, all the banks failed. You know, it was a Depression commonplace. I mean, this wasn't anything unusual. He never really explained why he went on the lam, I have to say. But so for me, the first kind of question was, well, where's the truth here? Was this man, in fact, an innocent victim of the Depression, or was he, in fact, an embezzler? And so for me, I'm going to talk a bit about the sort of research involved in doing this book, not in the secondary sources. I've already alluded to the fact that I had to do a lot of retooling. But when I first started researching it, I did the research from Los Angeles. And I went to the glorious, wonderful, beautiful Los Angeles Downtown Public Library. Has anybody ever visited it? Oh, well, it is spectacular, right? And I went into the genealogy room. That's where I really did all of my research, family genealogy. And one of the first things I started doing was looking at census records. Oh, my God. What were they called? The sound decks? Was it the sound deck system? Oh, oy. You know, that was really, this was not the world of ancestry. It was very laborious, very time-consuming. And then I was lucky, I was able to consult city directories for Colorado Springs from that library in Los Angeles, because they had holdings for a lot of city directories during this period of time. If you're at all interested in doing family history, city directories are absolutely essential. And actually, the city directories here are online up until the year 1920, 22 was what I thought. And so I was constantly, when I was here, also later doing research, I was all over those. And I often would consult them online. So city directories were really very key. Once Ancestry got up and running, then of course I was on Ancestry all the time, hours, because for me, it wasn't just, you might think, well, she just needs to do the immediate family. But I was trying to understand as much of Colorado Springs as I could. I was trying to understand the people that my family would have known, would have done business with. I wanted to know about the 3 other building and loan heads whose business practices really interested me. And this is a picture of you might want to turn the lights down here just so people could see this picture. I've never seen, I have a friend whom I showed this to, another historian, and she said, Alice, all these men in this period would pose themselves in this way, but this is not true. My grandfather in picture after picture looks like such an imposing figure. But I wanted to understand not just my grandfather and his business networks. I'm going to go back to this. I also wanted to understand this man and his business connections, his family connections, Willis Sims, whose suicide it was at the very end of 1931 that suggested that all was not right in the building and loan industry in Colorado Springs. I wanted to understand also his business dealings here. This was really what undid him, was his undoing, was the Buffalo Lodge, which, as you know, is still here, right? And that was Willis Sims's venture. But he had the misfortune of having it open right after the crash, right after the crash on Wall Street. And he really it really was his undoing, I think. I wanted people to understand Edward Scher, who had been, oh my goodness, he had worked for and with many of the Spring's most important capitalists, was himself a trained lawyer. And then this guy, Fred Bentel, who was quite a bit different from everybody else in that he was not a Republican, he was a Democrat, he was a Baptist, he was not a Protestant, and he had been a leader in the Klan. And so I wanted people to understand all of these folks and their business connections, their familial connections. And I also wanted to understand the depositors, the defrauded depositors. I mean, you're talking about between 5,000 and 6,000 people who lost their money, much of it. They would get, in the case of my grandfather's association, they got about 41% of their money back, but it took 10 years during the Depression for that to happen. It took, I think, Ed Scherer's depositors, it took a little less time, but it was 40%. Bentel's was in the teens, and it was negligible. And with Sims, they got, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was substantially less than 40, and well into the scandal, they had not seen a penny. So I wanted to give a sense of who these people were. And, you're talking about between 5,000 and 6,000 depositors. Obviously, I couldn't track all of these people down, but I could find out who the leaders were of the group of depositors who organized after the announcement of the last crash, the final fourth crash of the Building and Loan Association in town. And I just wanted to have a sense of sort of the city leaders. So I compiled a list. It was a very extensive list of, I think it was probably about between 350 and 500 names. I think I'm going to need the light back because I unfortunately wrote in pencil here. So there was that. And then, of course, I was able, when I was at this point working at UCLA, and I was able to order microfilmed reels of the Gazette from somewhere. It might even have been this library. It might have been Colorado College. And so that was a really important source. I went to the National Archives in Maryland and looked at the holdings of the HOLC records for Colorado, which were really important because the HOLC assumed a lot of those building and loan mortgages. That's the Home Owners Loan Corporation. And they helped quite a few people, not everybody, but who were underwater or who were in the risk of losing their homes. So I went to the National Archives there. I think the most delicious bit of research involved my FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. Because I figured this had been a pretty big case. I mean, when my grandfather was arrested, the story, it was, as I said, it was all over the papers. It took a while. I think it took about 8 to 10 months for it to arrive. And it was nearly 200 pages long. And it told aspects of his story in such amazing, granular, really novelistic detail about the Negro chauffeur whom he had hired, that was the term used, in New York City, to drive him all around the East Coast, where the theory has it that he was cashing Liberty bonds. He was actually cashing bonds that allowed him to remain on the lam. He was on the lam from June until December, when 2 detectives in New York City found him. And they found him through True Detective magazine. But I also, I mean, there were other, really key important pieces of research. Some of it came out of the trunk that had been stored the whole time that I was growing up in the basement. It was a Louis Vuitton trunk. It was closed, but it wasn't, I don't believe, ever locked. And so at any point, I could have gone into that trunk, right? I just never did. Because I knew nothing about this scandal. It never struck me there would be anything in that trunk. And then after I began working on this when my mother had to go into assisted living in Washington, D.C., and we had to put her home on the market. And that meant going through some of the stuff in the house, or not, because my mother certainly wasn't up to it. I was in the midst of finishing a book, and my sister didn't have a lot of time either. So we sold the house as is, which meant that the new owner took the responsibility of basically cleaning it up and cleaning it out. And one day I was talking to my sister on the phone a number of months after it had been sold, and she just happened to mention in conversation the 70 boxes that she had left stored in the attic. And by that point, I thought I might be writing a book about this, and I was like, 70? 70 boxes? And she had a whole explanation for why she had told the movers to leave it, which I won't go into. But there were 70 boxes, and I knew I had a pretty good sense I wanted to write about this, if not a book, an article. And so I got the phone number of the new owner, called her up, and she said, yeah, no problem. The contractor is months behind, as contractors typically are. She said, I'll go through the boxes. And of course, I would have liked to have gone through the boxes. Any historian would, but I didn't want to press my luck. And so she went through the boxes, and she found there were probably between 5 and 7, I can't quite remember, boxes that were just a treasure trove that included, and you might want to, included this photograph. And my grandfather always loved to have pictures of himself taken. He was big on that. But this as well was in this family archive. And it was written from, as it says here, the crowd of poor you owe. And it was after the insurance settlement had been announced in the Gazette and the Telegraph. And insurance money is a big piece of this story. And my grandmother was able to get a chunk of that insurance money, but not by any means all of it. But that angered, obviously, some depositors, and they wrote this threatening letter. Can you all read it? No? Okay. So this says, Mrs. Lula M. Davis, City. We will call at your ... home for the missing money and bonds, also a part of the insurance money. We'll also visit your ... attorney in Denver, then underlined in caps, be ready, signed the crowd of poor you owe. Sent, however, and this always mystified me, in an envelope that had sort of gilt edging. I always thought that was curious. So there was that. There was the passbook, surviving passbook, for my grandfather's association. This stuff, I'm trying to see if this stuff was all from the newspapers. But it's fair to say that there was an awful lot. There were photographs, there was correspondence, there was an incredibly valuable transcript of subpoenaed telegrams that had passed between my grandparents. That was just, allowed me to always place I could track their movements. And then, of course, I started coming here, and I started doing the research here, and was able to dig into the Gazette and the Telegraph and the Colorado Springs Independent and Common Sense Weekly, not a well-known newspaper. I think I need the lights again. And So Shortfall basically is a book about the cratering of the building and loan industry in Colorado Springs, but it's told in microcosm, right? There is a national story here. It wasn't just that, this wasn't just the only city whose building and loan industry failed or cratered. This happened across the nation. To about nearly 50% of all B&Ls. And, as I said, here in town, between 5,000 and 6,000 residents were depositors. And so the suffering was pretty intense. And one way you can measure this is whenever there was a courtroom, whenever there was going to be a court case, the courtrooms were just absolutely packed out with people. And this went on for years, because this was not resolved. This was not resolved for, as I said, for about a decade fully. It's a complicated story that I don't really have the time to get into, but there were a lot of problems in depositors getting their money, which had to do with scam artists, which sort of flooded Colorado Springs, trying to get desperate depositors to sell them their passbooks, their claims for stocks in like gold mining. And these were useless, right? And so that drama just kept this on the front page for years and years and years. And think of it, this is 1932 and beyond. It's not exactly an uneventful period. We're talking about a deepening depression. We're talking about the bonus army, FDR's election, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And then eventually, of course, when my grandfather was arrested, every paper in America of any size carried the story somewhere. And in Colorado Springs, it was all over the front page. Now, I did, as I said, a ton of research here, and I have to say, anybody who is interested in doing a family history project here, you cannot have better people to work with in this building. I mean, they are just the best. They're pros. And for instance, one of the newspapers that was very important to me in understanding the ways in which the defrauded depositors organized here was this newspaper, Common Sense Weekly. And as I said, Tim found me a partial run of it. I haven't been able to find it anywhere else. He also led me to the records of the big Cripple Creek Bank, which also had some very interesting correspondence in it. As I think I already mentioned, talking to Chris Nickel was, especially about the Klan, was very, very important. The Pioneers Museum acquired a small cache of my great-uncle Rui Davis's archive, but very small. And I'm indebted to Leah Witherow for telling me that they had acquired it. And, it's quite an amazing experience if you haven't actually looked at somebody's diary, to look at their diary. And in the case of Rui Davis, he was the brother of my grandfather, and he was a very successful businessman and also politician. And he really wanted to be the governor. This is Rui Davis. Anybody ever heard of the typewriter man? Well, his was the big office supply store in Colorado Springs. And to read his diary entries in the wake of the scandal, it was painful, because you could feel the man's weariness. He wrote about his depression. He wrote about not being able to, having arguments with his sister-in-law, with Walter's widow. And I think my favorite feature, and I'm going to talk about this discreetly, was the very discreet way in which he marked those days in which he and his wife had especially intimate contact. And he marked it with a star, I think, a star or a check. And I thought that was really an interesting feature, of the diary. Again, very discreetly marked. And when we figured that was probably what that had to mean, it just began to look that way. And so you don't know what you're going to find in these diaries. They could be pretty interesting. I think also looking at the houses, one of the things that I did when I was here with my wife, Kate, and who took a lot of pictures of the houses that were pertinent houses. The house where my grandparents lived, where my great uncles lived, and also where the mistress lived. And there. That's the mistress, Eva Terry, and you might want to turn it down just for a moment there. This is when she's being quizzed by the receiver for the City Savings Building and Loan Association, and she did spend time in jail, actually, subsequently. But one of the things that I found really fascinating about looking at these houses and these businesses was whether they survived or not very often seemed reflective of what was a pretty marked class divide within my grandfather's family. If you looked at the four brothers, my grandfather was very successful, of course, with other people's money. Rui Davis was also extremely successful. I mean, he was a big-time local Colorado Springs politician, and his typewriter shop did very well until the scandal. So, those houses on the North End, they were still there. They were in fine condition mostly. But you would look at Willard's house. He was the other brother, and he really struggled in life. And he was a gas jockey. He was a gas station attendant for a period of years. His houses were around, but in a pretty decrepit state. You looked at the brother's mother, who was the widow of somebody who had died of tuberculosis here, had come out here for the cure and hadn't worked. She didn't really have any money. And so that space ended up being demolished. Eva Terry's first home, and she was a working class girl, that ended up being demolished. Later found the cottage that she lived in. But to some extent, those houses of people who were not prosperous were those that could be very difficult to find or impossible to find because they had been demolished. But there was really nothing quite like doing the research on the ground, staying, for instance, at my grandfather's room in the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver. He had a room on a monthly basis there. And seeing how tiny the rooms were in those days, the hotel rooms, really claustrophobic. And this would have been where my mother was holed up when she was trying to avoid being kidnapped, because some of the depositors decided that the one way to bring Walter Davis home to justice was to kidnap her. And she would have stayed in that, she did stay in that hotel room. And so it was really, if you can get into the structures, if you can see the structures, it's just invaluable. It allowed the book, I think it gave the book that kind of novelistic quality, I have to say today, though, Kate and I were over on the block where my grandparents and my mother had lived, and a neighbor came over to us and asked us what we were doing, because she was taking a picture of me holding the book with my grandparents' house behind me. And this neighbor came up and said, "So what are you up to? So what are you doing?" Turns out that there was a neighbor 2 doors down who had been there since 1945, probably knew the whole scandal. And I thought, oh my God, why didn't I knock on every door of everybody on that block? So if you're going to be doing a family history project, be obnoxious, because you might learn something. And that is really the end of what I have to say, but I am quite eager to take questions. Yes?
One thing that interested me, and I sort of have been through most of the book, I haven't gotten quite to the denouement.
Oh, there is.
But I was really interested when you made the equivalence between the depositors in Walter Davis's Building and Loan, and then the people, and then going backwards in time to the original, the miners in Cripple Creek, and the workers in the mills, and the great battles between capital and labor, which resulted in the destruction of unions and the utter defeat of the American Federation of Miners.
That's right.
And then, but Colorado City remained a working class place. It was annexed to Colorado Springs in 1917.
Yes.
And then in the 20s, the Klan became very powerful in Colorado and in Colorado Springs. And you seem to imply that a lot of the Klansmen were people with strong links to the community of miners who just saw the people, and that the Klan was not so much a racist organization as it was one that was kind of represented the interests of the trampled working class as opposed to the capitalists who ran things.
I think a lot of work needs to be done on this. I think it is the case that when you look at the areas of Klan strength, they're in Colorado City. It's in Colorado City. It's in those old mining towns that have suffered. I think, in fact, that there are parallels to today and the Rust Belt. And these are people who feel like they have been shafted, and they have been shafted. And keep in mind that by the 20s, that kind of history, those feelings of solidarity that had once existed among the working class, among the mill workers there in Colorado City, and then among the miners in Cripple Creek and Victor and other places, that had dissipated. And the ability to fight back against the powers that be in Colorado Springs were limited. And I think one of the reasons that they gravitated to the Klan was because of the employment practices of some of those mining magnates and their managers hiring, trying to hire African Americans, getting a lot of pushback against that and finding it very difficult, sometimes impossible to. There were not a lot of African American miners there, but there was an attempt to, and I write about it in the book. It's in a footnote now. But also against other ethnic groups. The Second Klan was not so much anti-African American as it was anti-modernity, anti-young kids parking on some remote side of the road and necking, what educators might be teaching kids, some ethnic groups, in particular Italians. So it was a different kind of Klan, but I do think some of that frustration at feeling blocked, at feeling as though there really was for those guys really a gold ceiling. I think there was this tremendous amount of frustration, and with the downturn in the gold economy, they were not exactly well positioned, and so I think they were ripe for recruitment to the Klan, and I think they were ripe to be exploited by my grandfather and the other B&L men, whose customers they were disproportionately so. But I think that's a really interesting. I see my account of that as more suggestive than definitive, but I think I would really like to see that opened up and studied further. I think it's a really good question, yeah. Hi.
Good night.
You said that.
That way we can hear you.
You said that it was Sims who killed himself by gun?
Yeah.
How did Walt Davis die?
Well, you're going to have to read the book. I'm not revealing how my grandfather died, but I'm just saying, he didn't come to a good end. But, it varied a good deal what happened to these people. Sims, I suspect, was a really honorable man, and he just couldn't see his way out. There was no way out. I mean, he was trying to juggle accounts because he was also headed up a bank in town. You know the movie theater? That was the state bank building, and that's where he committed suicide. That's where he was found. His body was found. And I suspect, as I said, he was, more than... Well, this one is the one that still is operating. What is it called? The Twin Peaks or... Yeah, Kimball's. Yeah, that's it. That's where he committed suicide. Yeah. Yeah. But you look at Ed Scherer refused to admit guilt. He refused to. And of course, he had very well-placed friends. Governor Shoup, ex-Governor Shoup, very well-placed friends. He ended up spending 2.5 years, I think it was, in the county jail. He never went to the state pen. But that was it. There was no more. Bento, I'm trying to remember, I think he served for about 6 years, but much of it, it wasn't hard labor. He was teaching inmates accounting, ironically, even though this was a man who did not have a reputation as a good accountant. He was a man who would stuff notations about transactions into the cubbyhole of his desk and had completely miscalculated how much in debt he actually was. He was a completely incompetent accountant. So who knows? But he was teaching them. And he was somebody who said that he would actually reimburse the people he had defrauded. And of course, guess what? That didn't happen. So people met somewhat different fates. You look at Gilbert Biesemeyer in Los Angeles. His was the biggest of all the B&L crashes, $8.5 million shortfall. And he admitted embezzling. And he spent, I think it was about 10 years at the state pen. It's a really chilling story, I think, about Main Street capitalism, because as Americans, we tend to think, we know the guys on Wall Street are corrupt, right? We expect stories of greed and avarice and dishonesty from them. But we tend to think, I think many of us, I don't think I'm overgeneralizing here, maybe I am, but I think many of us assume that businessmen on Main Street are honest, the transactions are transparent, there's fairness, in large measure because there is face-to-face contact. Let me tell you, there was plenty of face-to-face contact here. You look at the court cases. That was one of the other big sources of research. Went to Denver, to the state archive there, and spent a lot of time looking at these court cases, court records. And it's like the kinds of things that my grandfather and others of these B&L men would say, you can get your money out whenever you want. No, I know that's what, but no, that's the rules, but we don't play by the rules. Well, in truth, they played by no rules. And in point of fact, that was one of the scariest things that I think I discovered was just how poorly regulated this industry was, shockingly so. But I do think we tend to have this idealized notion of Main Street. We want it to be this sort of repository of the site of good capitalism. And I'm not saying that it can't be, but the evidence here in this period was that there were plenty of cases in which it wasn't. Yeah.
I can probably project that. This touches on something you just mentioned, and it is prompted by the picture you had of the passbook. The city savings was state supervised. What degree of supervision was there present or not present, and how much scrutiny did this state supervision come under as a result of this, and were they excoriated for the results of their inefficiency?
Well, the supervision was a joke. I mean, none of the people working there were accountants. They didn't even really know what they were doing. The guy who headed up the B&L agency, the agency that was meant to supervise all the building and loans in Colorado, was a guy named Eli Gross. And it was an appointment made by the governor, by Governor Adams. And I wouldn't want to presume that he was a bad man, but he certainly was not competent in his job. And he had a deputy commissioner working under him who was a man who had accepted a very big loan from my grandfather without any collateral, and there was no evidence that it had been repaid. I think his name was Byron Miller. Eli Gross, who again ran this commission for the state, had a group of men around him who were his advisors. Well, that would have included, guess what? Walter Clyde Davis. And there was also the really corrupt crew in nearby Pueblo. That was also a huge crash. And Miles Saunders, who was a politician, had been a politician and a DA there. He was very, very prominent. He was also part of this, and he also, he died before he could be sent to prison. But the other people in that Pueblo railway building and loan did go to prison. That was a court case that just went on and on and on, which is to say, no, there was very little state supervision. And in fact, when the first newspaper articles about this scandal started to be written, people would say, but of course, Davis can be charged on filing false reports about the condition of his building and loan. It turned out that wasn't law. People thought it was illegal that Davis and all the others hadn't really started these associations with anything like a substantial piece of their own money. Guess what? That wasn't part of the law either. And so, people were furious for very good reasons, but there was so much gray area around this. And to the extent that there were successful prosecutions, it was because people were so furious and desperate. In Los Angeles, the situation was so bad that the commissioner there, the state commissioner there for building and loans, had to move his family out of their home because of bomb threats. This was not just, it is true the West was hit particularly hard, but it's not the case that it didn't happen in other places. It happened in Philadelphia, it happened in Texas, it happened in many, many cities and towns.
Maybe I missed something in this. I saw the newspaper ad and came to this, so I have no history whatsoever. I've only been here 18 months. So from what I hear, there were 4 savings and loans in town. Were all 4 corrupt? Did all 4 fail?
Yes.
That's kind of the next.
Yes.
On one hand, you implied that there were a number that were actually good, that in fact did fail because of the Depression, whereas there were others that were corrupt.
No.
This mix between who was good and failed versus who was bad and failed.
I think, Sims, what I said about him is that I imagine he was an honorable man. I do think he killed himself because of his shame. I think he couldn't live with himself. And he knew his family was going to lose their home. He was a total pillar of the community. He was a master mason. He had led the 4-minute drive during World War I. He had been the most stand-up of stand-up guys. He had served in the legislature. And he just couldn't take it, I think. But it doesn't mean that he was honest. He thought he was reckless. And he thought that he could make money with building this auto lodge. And it turned out that it didn't work. It turned out the Depression happened. And he just kept trying to juggle accounts. And he stole from his brother. He didn't pay his brother back. He stole from a variety of people. So I would say that all of them were corrupt. Now, I would say that my grandfather was the one who began offering 6% on savings, which was pretty high, right? That was not sustainable ultimately. And he was the one who started doing that. Now, he may have been following the lead of the folks in Pueblo. I'm not sure. But then that led to other people coming on board, like Fred Bentel, and this is his savings and loan, and he began to offer 7%. And these were not sustainable rates, right? And so it was effectively a Ponzi scheme. Now, Sims did not run his as a Ponzi scheme. His was he just juggled money. But when it came to Bental, when it came to Scherer, and when it came to Davis, they were all running them as Ponzi schemes. Yeah, and they were all corrupt. But no, I'm sure that I know that there were building and loan men throughout the country who were not corrupt and who were not doing this. But one of the things that had happened in the building and loan industry was that it was an industry that was prone to corruption. And there had been a big scandal in the late 1880s and 1890s, which was the first big failure rate of B&Ls because they had been taken over by unscrupulous businessmen. And then in the 20s, you found unscrupulous businessmen muscling in on B&L territory and opening up building and loans that were offering, spectacular rates on savings. Which really broke from the B&L model. The original B&L model was one that was was a vehicle for working class empowerment. B&Ls were supposed to promote and enable working class home ownership with reasonable rates, reasonable times to pay back, and to encourage thrifty savings. These guys enter into the market in the 20s and pervert the model. They hijack the business and pervert the model. And one of the most interesting things about it is that you won't find this history in standard accounts of the thrift industry because the thrift industry had a very powerful trade league that planted upbeat stories in the press about the wonderful state of B&Ls during the Depression, whose leaders worked with the federal government, which was very anxious to stabilize the housing industry, to build on top of the dying building and loan industry a shiny new savings and loan industry that was federally chartered and which would in fact be federally insured. It meant that people would not be at risk of losing their deposits, right? Very tightly controlled, very well regulated, right, by the federal government. And of course that all went during the Reagan years when you had deregulation. And the reason this history is important for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons it's important is that had the people in the 1980s who were opposed to the deregulation of the S&L industry, had they known the history of this, had they known that this very tightly controlled, constrained, and regulated S&L industry, which was indeed not doing well in these years, but had they understand that those regulations had been put in place not just because of a depression, but because of fraud, then they would have had a more powerful argument. And they could have perhaps slowed down that process of deregulation, put a bit of a brake on it, and made it less absolutely reckless, because at the end of the day, that was an $150 billion bailout that American taxpayers paid. And so that's what happens when you don't have the history or when you forget the history.
Well, thank you so much, Alice. Let's give her a hand.